Rose was only 10 years old when her father remarried. At first, she hoped her new stepmother, Eleanor, would bring joy to their home. But as time went on, Rose realized Eleanor had a heart as cold as winter. When Rose's father fell ill and passed away a few years later, Eleanor showed her true colors. She treated Rose like a servant, forcing her to cook, clean, and do all the chores while Eleanor and her spoiled daughters, Clara and Margaret, spent their days gossiping and dressing in fine clothes. "You're lucky to have a roof over your head," Eleanor would sneer whenever Rose tried to complain. Rose's once beautiful hands became rough from scrubbing floors, and her simple dresses were patched and worn. But no matter how much Eleanor scolded or insulted her, Rose remained kind and hopeful, holding on to the belief that one day, things would get better. One cold winter morning, Rose was carrying a heavy basket of firewood into the house when Eleanor stopped her at the door. "Put that down and listen to me," Eleanor barked. Rose set the basket down and looked up, shivering in her thin shawl. "I've decided your future," Eleanor said with a wicked grin. "You're going to marry." Rose's heart sank. "Marry? But..." "Don't interrupt me," Eleanor snapped. "A man has agreed to take you off my hands. You'll marry him tomorrow." "But who is he?" Rose asked nervously. Eleanor's grin widened. "He's a beggar. Poor and pitiful, just like you, but don't worry, he'll be happy to have a wife who knows how to work hard." Rose's face turned pale. "You can't do this. I don't even know him." "I can, and I will," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "You should be grateful anyone wants you at all." That night, Rose cried herself to sleep. She dreamed of escaping, but she had no money, no family, and nowhere. The next day, Eleanor dragged Rose to a shabby chapel on the edge of town. Standing outside was Thomas, the man Rose was supposed to marry. He looked even worse than she had imagined. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his hair was messy. His eyes, however, were kind. "This is her?" Thomas asked, looking at Rose. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Take her and be gone." Rose stared at the ground, too ashamed to meet his gaze. She wanted to run, but where would she go? With a heavy heart, she nodded. "I'll marry you," she said quietly. The ceremony was quick, and there was no celebration. When it was over, Thomas turned to Rose and said, "Come with me. I'll take care of you." Rose didn't believe him, but she had no choice. She followed him, leaving her old life and her cruel stepmother behind. Thomas led Rose to his small, weathered cottage at the edge of the forest. The roof was patched with old straw, and the windows rattled in the wind. Inside, the place was plain, just a table, the bed, and a fireplace that barely gave off warmth. "This is your home now," Thomas said, gesturing around. Rose looked around in disbelief. The walls were bare, and there was hardly any food on the shelves. "How can anyone live like this?" she muttered under her breath. Thomas heard her but didn't reply. Instead, he brought out a bowl of steaming soup. "Eat," he said simply. Rose hesitated. She was hungry, but her pride stung. "I'm not eating this," she snapped. Thomas didn't argue. He quietly set the bowl down and walked away. That night, as Thomas slept on the floor to give her the bed, Rose made her first attempt to escape. She crept to the door and opened it slowly, trying not to make a sound. But as soon as she stepped outside, her foot crunched on dried leaves. "Where are you going?" Thomas's calm voice stopped her in her tracks. Rose turned around, her face red. "I can't stay here. I don't belong in this miserable life." Thomas stood and crossed his arms. "If you leave now, where will you go? Do you have money? A place to stay?" Rose's silence answered his questions. "Come back inside," he said gently. "It's cold out there." She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Shivering, she stepped back into the house, and Thomas covered her with a blanket before returning to his spot on the floor. Over the next few days, Rose tried to run away several more times. Each time, Thomas caught her, sometimes by luck, other times because she got lost in the dense forest. "Why do you keep stopping me?" she yelled after her fourth attempt. "Because I promised to take care of you," Thomas said simply. "But why? I never asked for your help." Thomas sighed. "Maybe you didn't. But everyone deserves kindness, Rose. Even you." His words stayed with her, though she refused to show it. One evening, after a particularly cold day, Rose sat by the fireplace with her arms crossed. She hadn't eaten all day, refusing to touch the plain porridge Thomas had offered. "You're going to get sick if you don't eat," Thomas said, placing a fresh bowl in front of her. "I don't want it," she snapped. He didn't push her. Instead, he grabbed a heavy coat from the hook by the door and draped it over her shoulders. "Why are you always so kind to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas knelt beside her. "Because I know what it feels like to have no one." For the first time, Rose felt her anger soften. One night, as Rose lay awake, she overheard Thomas talking to himself. "I hope she's happy one day," he murmured. "Even if she never sees me as anything more than a beggar." His words broke something inside her. She realized that Thomas had done nothing but care for her, even when she had treated him poorly. The next morning, she decided to try something new. When Thomas handed her a bowl of soup, she took it without complaining. When he worked outside chopping firewood, she joined him, offering to carry the logs. Thomas noticed the change but didn't say anything. He simply smiled, then for the first time, Rose felt a glimmer of warmth in her heart. Days turned into weeks, and Rose began to notice more about Thomas. Despite his worn clothes and simple life, there was something about him that didn't add up. He seemed far too knowledgeable for someone who claimed to be poor. He would talk about faraway places, great cities, and grand businesses with such detail that it felt like he had seen them himself. One day, as he was mending an old chair, Rose couldn't hold back her curiosity anymore. "How do you know so much about the world?" she asked, her voice careful. Thomas chuckled. "I've read a lot, and I've traveled." "But how? A beggar can't afford to travel or buy books." Thomas didn't answer directly. "Sometimes, life surprises you," he said with a mysterious smile. One afternoon, as Thomas was away collecting firewood, Rose decided to clean the house. While sweeping, she noticed a small door in the corner of the cottage that was always locked. She had never paid much attention to it before, but now her curiosity burned. She tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. But as she looked closer, she noticed a key hanging on a nearby hook. Hesitating for a moment, she took it and unlocked the door. Inside, she found something shocking. The small room wasn't filled with old rugs or tools as she expected. Instead, it was lined with shelves of expensive books, fine clothes, and boxes filled with gold coins and papers. Rose picked up one of the papers and gasped. It was a deed to a large estate, signed with the name Thomas Harrington. When Thomas returned, Rose was sitting at the table, the deed in her hands. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the paper. Thomas froze for a moment, then sighed. "I suppose it's time I told you the truth." He sat across from her, his eyes serious but kind. "I'm not a beggar, Rose. My name is Thomas Harrington, and I'm one of the wealthiest men in the region." Rose stared at him in disbelief. "Then why the disguise? Why live like this?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only cared about my money. I wanted to find someone who could see me for who I am, not what I own." So, I gave it all up, at least for a while, to find a wife who would love me without knowing my fortune. Rose's hands trembled. So, you were testing me? In a way, Thomas admitted. But I never expected to meet someone as strong and kind as you. You've been through so much, yet you've stayed true to yourself. Rose's mind swirled with emotions, anger, confusion, but also something new, admiration. Thomas, the man she had once resented, had shown her nothing but care and kindness, even when she had been harsh toward him. So, what now? She asked, her voice quiet. That's up to you, Thomas said. If you want to leave, I'll help you start a new life wherever you choose. But if you're willing to stay, I'll show you the real life I can offer. Rose looked into his eyes and saw nothing but honesty. Slowly, she nodded. I'll stay, she whispered. The next day, Thomas took Rose to his true home, a grand estate hidden behind tall gates and surrounded by lush gardens. The house was enormous, with marble floors and glittering chandeliers. This is where I live, Thomas said, watching her reaction. Rose was overwhelmed. She had never imagined such a place. But as she looked around, she realized something: the house didn't matter. What mattered was the man standing beside her, the man who had shown her what true kindness meant. Over time, Rose and Thomas built a life together, one filled with love, trust, and the shared goal of helping others in need. Rose's heart, once hardened by hardship, bloomed with happiness. And as for Eleanor and her daughters, they were left behind, their schemes crumbling without Rose to exploit. Rose had suffered greatly, but her pain had led her to something greater than she ever dreamed, a love built not on wealth, but on the richness of the heart.